The most important reflection, I think, fundamental reflection on the Gordon Zahn article, Social Science and the Theology of War, is a reflection on the first sentence. Namely, military planners operate on the basis of military expediency, and individual soldiers are trained to operate on the basis of unquestioning obedience to their military superiors. If that sentence is true, it is difficult to perceive how Christians, whether lay, clerical, or religious, can support and condone the entrance of Christian young men and women into the military. When the sentence says that military planners operate on the basis of military expediency, the question is, what is military expediency? Military expediency is nothing short of learning how to kill, maim, torture, and prosecute suffering in general efficiently. If war is the resolution of international conflict by means of the prosecution of mass suffering, torture, and death, then military efficiency is learning how to do that well and quickly. How, in the name of anything that can be called Christian, is it possible to send young men and women into a program, the sole purpose of which is to teach them how to maim, kill, torture efficiently? Beyond that, the second half of the sentence relates that soldiers are trained to operate on the basis of unquestioning obedience to their military superiors. What does unquestioning obedience mean? It means nothing more that soldiers are in a chain of command, a chain of dominative power, a chain of fear, in which they have to do what those above them say they must do, or they will be hurt and hurt badly. Unquestioning obedience means nothing other than when they are told to kill, maim, torture, or whatever other activity is felt to be in the best interest of military expediency, they must do it, and they must do it unquestioningly. How, once again, in the name of anything that's Christian, can Christian institutions, can Christian people, whether lay, clerical, or religious, condone such activity, promote such activity on the part of Christian men and women? This amounts to nothing more than entering into a system where one becomes a dropout in the moral universe. If one cannot maim, if one cannot torture, if one cannot kill, if one cannot hand over his responsibilities to other people, say as an individual in civilian society, how in the name of heavens can one do in a crowd what he can't do alone? Where in the New Testament does it say that as long as I'm obeying the orders of President Tanaka or President Ford or President this or Prime Minister this, as long as they have ordered it, it becomes Christian? That I can unquestioningly obey. Also, the first sentence raises the question, do military planners, if they are operating on the basis of military expediency, do they in fact ask themselves, is what they are ordering people to do consistent with the teachings of the gospel? Of course they don't. It would be absurd to think that they do. Military planners are no more interested in what Jesus had to say than the devil himself. In fact, the devil himself might be more interested. They're interested in what is necessary in order to maim, torture, kill, and prosecute suffering efficiently when they are called upon to do it. They do not measure what they are about according to the standards of the gospel. If they do not measure it, then how in the name of heavens can Christians walk into an institution and unquestioningly obey what they're told to do, the orders that they're given? We used to have a category in moral theology, a valid category, misused as all kinds of valid theological concepts can be, called the occasion of sin. Basically, the idea was one did not walk into a pornographic movie because one was 100% sure that he would become or she would become a lustful person by watching such a movie. One did not walk into it because one realized that going into such a situation, the chances were so overwhelmingly against your becoming or remaining a non-lustful person that you simply didn't do it. Isn't the same thing true here? At a bare minimum, what is the moral legitimacy of walking into this kind of conditioning process? This kind of process that literally makes it impossible to apply the standards of just war theory. This kind of process that's based solely on military expediency and unquestioning obedience. Where is the moral legitimacy of entering into it? Isn't military training an occasion of sin? Isn't being in the military of itself an occasion of sin? Even for the non-pacifist Christian. As we look down the page, and the third paragraph begins with the statement, the military training program is crucial to the argument, in that it may be seen as a set of social controls designed to subject the individual trainee to a process of systematic depersonalization in the interest, is that word again, of increased military efficiency. And we know what that means. What are Christian colleges doing with military training programs on their campus? What are Christian high schools doing setting up booths for military recruiters to come in to induce people into entering into this program, which over and above the fact that it teaches people how to kill, what else does it do to them in the process? What do they become in the process? Is this Christian? Can Christians enter this responsibly? Well, in case you think this is a problem that is simply relegated to people who are 18 or 20 years old, let me ask you this. If a Christian cannot, in good faith, as opposed to bad faith, enter into this kind of institution, how can Christians pay for this kind of institution to exist? How can Christians turn over their tax money so that people can plan how to expediently kill, murder, maim, and torture on a mass scale, so that people can condition other people to unconditional obedience to orders to murder, maim, torture on a mass scale? The military training program is not exclusively a problem of 18 or 20-year-old people. If Christians can't go into it, and that's a question, how can Christians pay for it? Is the military training program at its root institutionally sinful? institutionally evil. Not only for what it ultimately plans to do and does, but for how it goes about dealing with people who are in it, and for what it does to people in the process of teaching them, training them, conditioning them, brainwashing them into becoming professional, paid killers. To show you what can be done when people become dropouts in the moral universe, when people obey orders exclusively on command, when the military training program works well, when the mentality is created that it's reasonable, right, just, and even holy to treat persons as things for the purpose of self-gratification, for some self-interest, I think we should stop now and take a look at a rather famous film called Night and Fog. What I hope we will not do is to limit the application of the film to a particular group of people at a particular time, a particular space. I hope we will be able to universalize what we see here and realize that this is what Sartre, Berrigan, Nikolai Berdyaev are talking about when they say that the greatest sin of the age is making the concrete abstract, turning persons, if you will, into ideas, into numbers, into objects to be manipulated for the gratification and self-interest of others. So why don't we stop now and take a look at Night and Fog. Thomas Merton, in a book called Conjectures of the Guilty Bystander, the section entitled Technology and Death, writes, "Here is an excerpt from a letter of I.A. Toff & Sons, manufacturers of heating equipment, to the Commandant of Auschwitz concerning the new heating system. Quote, we acknowledge the receipt of your order for 5 triple furnaces, including 2 electric elevators for the raising and lowering of the corpses, and 1 emergency elevator. For putting the bodies into the furnace, we suggest simply a metal fork moving on a cylinder. For transporting the corpses, we suggest using light carts on wheels. We are submitting plans for our perfected cremation ovens, which operate with cold and have hitherto given you full satisfaction. We guarantee their effectiveness as well as their durability." Here is Merton writing on, quoting an excerpt from Himmler, talking to the SS at Auschwitz. Most of you know what it means when 100 corpses are lying side by side, or 500, or 1,000. But to have stuck it out, and at the same time, apart from exceptions due to understandable human weakness, to have remained decent fellows, that is what has made us hard. This is a page of our glory. Jacques Maritain, Merton quoting Maritain, on the practical atheism of Christians. That is, Christians, people who take on the name Christian, but for all practical purposes function as atheist. Maritain. The Christian atheists keep in their minds the setting of religion for the sake of appearance and outward show, but they deny the gospel and they despise the poor. They pass through the tragedy of their times with only resentment against anything that endangers their self-interest, in fear for their own prestige and possessions. The Christian atheist can contemplate without flinching every kind of injustice if it does not threaten their own way of life. Only concerned with power and success, they are either anxious to have the means of external coercion enforce what they term the moral order, or else they turn with the wind and are ready to comply with any requirement of so-called historical necessity. The Christian atheists await the deceivers. They are famished for deception because, first, they themselves are trying to deceive God. It's important to realize that, as with all wars, liturgical Christianity was at its height in Germany during the Second World War. Let me read you, this is from the New York Times, April 1973, an article by Anthony Lewis. It reads, "Those with weak stomachs for the unpleasant should stop reading now. It's not really proper to call them men. Shapes is a better word. Grotesque sculptors of scarred flesh, of gnarled limbs. Years of being shackled in tiger cages has forced them into a permanent pretzel-like crouch. They move like crabs skittering across the floor on their buttocks." That was a description in Time magazine recently of an exceptional group of human beings, former political prisoners in South Vietnam. They're exceptional because they exist. Those who go to South Vietnam prison island of Con Son rarely emerge in any living form. The Time report filed by David DeVos quoted one of the men as saying he had been arrested one day in the park with his wife. "The police attached electrodes to my genitals. They broke my fingers and hung me from the ceiling by my feet. They did these things to my wife, too, and they forced my children to watch. In the tiger cages, cells of Con Son," the report said, "water is limited to 3 swallows a day, forcing prisoners to drink their own urine." That picture of what happens of those arrested by the Saigon government on political suspicion is the same as many other conscientious and unhysterical observers have given. You remember, at the close or in the middle of the Night and Fog movie, it says, it shows the commandant, and it says that the commandant doesn't know, or says that the commandant says he doesn't know what's going on. And then the question after that slide is, and who else doesn't know? Who else doesn't know what's going on now? How many people didn't know that the tiger cages were being paid for totally by their tax money from the United States? How many people didn't know that the tiger cages, in fact, were actually physically made in the United States? Who else doesn't know? At the end of the movie, the last statement is, who is responsible? Who is responsible? Who else doesn't know? Let me read you A section from the trial of the Catonsville Nine. This is actual testimony by George Mishi, who was a member of the Catonsville Nine. The testimony is about the fact that he did not understand when he was in the Peace Corps why people in Latin America were not accepting him. In fact, were throwing rocks at him. He says, "This confused me. But after I became involved at a higher level, I started to understand why bricks were thrown at us. I was working in two countries where revolutions had taken place. I should not say revolution, I should say coup d'etat. The military overthrow of governments. Two democratically elected governments were overthrown by the military with Pentagon support. At that point, I felt I could not in conscience go on with this work, because John Kennedy had said we would not deal with military dictatorships. At the overthrow of democracy, we would stop all military support, all economic support. We would withdraw our people and force the leaders to return to democracy." Well, when I saw the opposite occur, I resigned. This reversal of things had the most impact on me in the Dominican Republic. That was such a tragedy as to be unbelievable. A man like Trujillo ran that country for 32 years. When someone dared talk about social change or social reform, they would go into his house, take the head of the family out of the house, cut off his penis, put it in his mouth, cut off his arms and legs, and drop him in the doorway. And all with the help and training of the United States government. In the Boston Globe, in May of 1976, on the front page there was an article entitled, "Iran Trying to Barter Oil for American Jets." The article reads, "The government of Iran is seeking to barter surplus crude oil to American defense contractors for hundreds of millions of dollars worth of jet aircraft. The administration sources say Iran is exploring the possibility of using the oil rather than cash to obtain as many as 300 F-16 fighters from McDonnell Douglas and up to 255 land-based versions of the F-18 jet fighter from Northrop. The Ford administration isn't introducing any objection to the sale or potential barter agreement." That's page 1 of the Boston Globe, May 1976. In front of the editorial section of the Boston Globe, same page, same Sunday, in May 1976, there is an article entitled, "Torture in Iran," by a man who was tortured there, an Iranian by the name of Raza Bahini. Let me read you some excerpts from that article. "He looked at my wife. 'Madam,' he said, 'we'll bring the professor back in 2 hours.' Nobody said a word. Their 2 hours means 102 days. Sometimes it means a whole eternity. Once you are in their prisons in Iran, that's it. They took everything away from me when they blindfolded me. I had no belt, no shoelaces, no socks, no handkerchief, no pen, no pencils, paper. The double chin, the protruding global belly rising right below the double chin, the yellow teeth with 1 or 2 teeth studded in gold, and the fist ever ready to rain blows upon me, and the instruments for hanging from the walls convinced me at a glance that I was now in for something I had not expected in this life. It was a sudden revelation with both sudden and gradual consequences. Tie him up. Go and lie down. There was a bed on the floor. There were also 2 other iron beds, one on the top and another in the corner of the room. These 2, I learned, were used to burn the backs of prisoners. They tie you in the upper bed on your back, and with the heat coming from a torch and a small heater in the lower bed, they burn your back in order to extract information. Sometimes the burning is extended to the spine, and paralysis results. There are also all sizes of whips and nails hanging from the wall, electric prods and electric stools, and of course there was the nail-plucking instruments. The gallows stood on the other side. They hang you upside down, and then they beat you with a club on your legs, and then they use the electric prods on your chest and your genitals, and then they lower you down, and they pull down your pants, and then they rape you while you're hanging upside down. There were other torture rooms where other instruments were used. There were the weight cuffs that break your shoulders in less than 2 hours of horrible torture. The electric shock instruments, apparently a recent introduction into the Iranian torture industry. The pressure devices which impose pressure on your skull to the extent that you either talk or your bones in your head break to pieces. When the whip came down, it was like a huge hot charcoal, live and burning, tearing at the soles of my feet, crippling my whole legs. I was screaming at the top of my voice. Now I could understand the meaning of the screams of other people the night before. Those screams stayed with me for 102 days while I was in prison. And when I left the prison, they stayed with me. They've never left me. Once, months later, when I called my interrogator to tell him that I wanted to leave Iran for a few days, as soon as he picked up the receiver, the same nauseating, pleading, pitiful screams could be heard over the telephone. In only a few hours, the torture chamber takes you back to the primal forest with fear as the only reigning monarch. The meaning of life departs, and you are suspended in a void in which you are totally alone, and desperately alone. The hell is with you until you disappear, and then somehow it moves on in the eternity of its own infernal presence, because after all, torture goes on living even when you don't. Having come out of that hell, I know that there is nothing supernatural about it. It is a hell made by one man for another man, and it must be destroyed by men. It's all supported by money from the United States. Thomas Merton, in his Faith and Violence, writes, "The theology of violence must not lose sight of the real problem of violence, which is not the individual with the revolver, but death and genocide as big business. But this big business of death is all the more innocent and effective because it involves a long chain of individuals, each of whom feels himself absolved from responsibility, and each of whom can perhaps salve his conscience by contributing a more meticulous effort to his part in the massive operation of murder. We know, for instance, Adolf Eichmann and others like him felt no guilt for their share in the extermination of Jews. This feeling of justification was due partly to their absolute obedience to higher authority and partly to the care and efficiency which went into their work. Since they were dealing with numbers and objects and not with people, and since their jobs were ones of bureaucratic organization, apparently they could forget the reality of what they were doing. The same is true to even a greater extent of modern war, in which the real moral problems are not to be located in the rare instances of hand-to-hand combat, but in the remote planning and organization centers of technological destruction. The real crimes of modern war are not committed on the front, but are committed in the war offices and the ministries. Modern technological murder is not directly visible, like individual murder. It is abstract, corporate, businesslike, cool, free of guilt feelings, and therefore 1,000 times more deadly and effective. It is this polite, massively organized, white-collar murder machine that threatens the world with destruction, and not the violence of a few desperate teenagers in the slums. But our antiquated theology myopically focuses on individual violence alone and fails to see this. It shudders at the phantasm of muggings and killings when it makes a mess on our doorstep. But our theology blesses and canonizes the antiseptic violence of corporately organized murder, because corporately organized murder is respectable, clean, efficient, and above all, profitable. In a 1972 issue of Life magazine, there was a picture of a Marine recruiting program. At the bottom of the picture, it reads, "Screeching ya kill, Marines thrust their M1s into the air. The DI can turn them on or off with a flick of his fist." What does turn them on or off mean? Thomas Merton, quoting Gandhi, says, Gandhi, "The business of every God-fearing man is to disassociate himself from evil in total disregard of the consequences. He must know that it is better to die in the way of God than to live in the way of Satan." Is it possible to continue to silently say nothing and thereby approve of how our tax dollars are being used? If we are Christians, doesn't the problem of violence have anything to do with the witness that we must give? It is the teaching of the Old and New Testament that where more is required, silence is sinful.